This is a graph showing the percentage of French speakers in Quebec. Put simply, the language has been declining since 2001, even if slowly. It's quite a hard thing to come to terms with. I mean, Quebec is the only province in Canada where the francophones make up the majority of the population. And for Quebecers, preserving the French language is the only possible safeguard for the survival of the Quebec identity and culture. So in a world where everything is dominated by English-speaking media, Quebec is trying to save their province from anglicisation. But to understand not only how, we must first understand the way in which French initially survived. Canada was initially a French colony within the larger territory of New France after being claimed in 1535. But following the successful conquest of New France by British forces during the 7 Years' War, it became a part of the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1763. During all this, a period of violence and unrest was constant between the French-speaking population and the British, and continued during the American Revolution, with many of them siding with the Americans. All of this growing tension made the British fear that due to the proximity and already well-formed alliance, the Americans would help the inhabitants of New France rebel against British rule. So rather than engage in another costly war at the same time to try colonize them, Britain reluctantly passed the Quebec Act of 1774 to maintain peace, which allowed them to have French as their official language, use French law, and stay Catholic, or in other words, keep their culture. This rebelling against the English by preserving the French language really set the stage for everything we've seen since, and is still present today. Many laws, acts, and bills have been passed since in order to assure that the French language would remain alive and well in Quebec. During the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, which was basically a period of intense socio-political and socio-cultural change in French Canada, Quebec created the French Language Office, which was a public institution responsible for the assurance of the correct usage of French and enrichment of the spoken and written language. In 1974, the Official Languages Act was adopted, making French the sole official language of Quebec. But that wasn't enough though, so then came the Charter of the French Language, aka Bill 101 in 1977, requiring that French must be the language of legislation at the courts, administration, work, business, and education. Even in 2020, there was an amendment introduced to Bill 101 that stated that all government communications would be exclusively in French when communicating with other government bodies and companies. So with all this in place, you'd think that Quebec would be able to protect the French language from declining, right? Well, it's not that simple. In fact, it hasn't really worked, besides slowing the decline of it. The proportion of Quebecers who only speak French as their primary official language fell from 83.7% in 2016 to 82.2% in 2021. And in that same time period, the number of people speaking English as their primary language increased from 12 to 13%. So in total, the English-speaking population has increased by 1.2 million, while the French-speaking population has increased by 120,000, 10 times less. Now, this is obviously scary news for Quebecers. So, as a result, the nationalist coalition Avenir Quebec, or CAQ for short, was re-elected in October of 2022 and gained a huge parliamentary majority on the premise that it would protect French as the dominant language in Quebec. As for how they plan to do this, well, let me introduce you to Bill 96. Passed into law on June 1st, 2022 and set to roll out in the coming years, this is without a doubt the most comprehensive bill ever passed by the Quebec government. Cited as a language protection bill, Bill 96 is set to reshape many aspects of public life for Quebecers. The first part has to deal with immigration. See, declining birth rates among francophone Quebecers has been a key problem for quite some time. With less and less native Quebec people, you can't expect the language to be passed on to new generations as a first language they're most comfortable in. Even with immigrants coming to try and replenish these numbers, they're simultaneously contributing to the fall of French. More and more allophones, which in Canada are people who speak neither English or French as a first language, are choosing to learn English rather than French. In 2021, 25% of immigrants said English was their first official language spoken, up from 18% in 2016. The trend was reversed on the French side, from 61 to 55% in the same amount of time. Quebec Premier François Legault has claimed that speaking French at home is key to preserving the French language, and it's been calculated that 55% needs to be closer to 90% in order to maintain the linguistic balance in the province. Now, the answer to this problem possibly lies in new immigration restrictions, part of Bill 96. In previous governments, about 50 to 60% of economic immigrants who selected to immigrate to Quebec spoke French, but now it's been upped to a minimum percentage of 80%, with the ultimate goal of having an intake of 100% French-speaking immigrants by 2026. In the meantime, if you're one of those non-French speaking immigrants, it's quite tough. Upon arrival in Quebec, immigrants are allowed to receive services in English for up to 6 months. The refusal or inability to communicate in French a mere 6 months after arrival will result in the halting of all services unless it's extremely important to your health. The use of any other language is forbidden past that 6-month mark, which, to say the least, is very intense. Luckily though, there's also been a proposition to create a one-stop service center for learning French, Francophones Quebec, combining services which are currently spread across multiple ministries. The goal of this is to offer convenient language services and resources to newcomers in order to help them integrate and ultimately streamline the immigration process. But the message is clear. The government is now prioritizing the revitalization of the French language at all costs. This is just one aspect of Bill 96.2. In the courts and justice system, judges will no longer be required to know any other specific language other than French. While Quebecers will always have the right to seek justice in the courts in either English or French, the reality of how common it will be to have a bilingual judge going forward has now been called into question. When it comes to the government, elected politicians and ministers will not be required to have any knowledge of English either. In terms of business, while companies providing goods and services with 50 or more employees are already required to serve their clients in French, the threshold has now been lowered to a minimum of 25 employees. So as to make sure small businesses are doing it as well, being required to go through a French certification process verifying that all internal and external communications are in French. Business contracts must be drawn up in French, and if there are versions of a contract in 2 languages, the French will take priority if there is a discrepancy. A company's pleadings in court will also obviously have to be in French, or translated into French too. In terms of education reform, it's also a bit wild. For students in elementary or high school, Bill 96 is putting a 3-year cap on the number of years children of foreign temporary workers or foreign students can attend school in English. For students of college age, the total number of them allowed in English language colleges as a proportion of overall students can't be higher than the year before, and will also be capped at 17.5% of the total provincial college population. Access to English language programs in French colleges will be reduced too. The mandatory French language exams that students must pass in order to graduate from French colleges will also be extended to francophones and allophones studying at English colleges. The new law says that a student who doesn't have the speaking and writing knowledge of French required by the government can't get a diploma. So this means whether or not you studied at an English or French university, you'll need to take a French exam, and if you fail, you can't graduate. The last part of the bill essentially focuses on enforcing everything it's doing. See, in 2003, the French Language Office of the past was renamed to the Quebec Board of the French Language, or OQLF for short, and has begun acting almost like a language police ever since. If Quebecers think their right as customers to be informed and served in French isn't met, they can send a complaint to the OQLF to get things sorted. As for if it works, let's see. In 2013, they told off an Italian restaurant for having too much Italian on its menu when French should be the predominant language. In 2015, they forced a hospital in Gasp to take down bilingual signposts they had up, even though a sizable English-speaking population live in the region. The OQLF has even demanded that small stickers on restaurant windows that say stuff like "recommended by TripAdvisor" be taken down since it's not in French. Really, there's countless examples, and Bill 96 basically gives them more power. They have newfound jurisdiction to inspect workplaces and seize materials at will without a warrant if they suspect English is being used. It's now easier to make complaints if you feel your right to communication in French was violated. Complaints can now be truly enforced better, and financial penalties have been increased up to $22,000. The Office of the French Language may seem like a rampaging institution of linguistic extremism to some, but to others, it's a strong protector of an important culture. You need to remember that Quebec is a province that's basically surrounded by over 350 million speakers of another language. And it's not just any language either, it's English, the most powerful and global one out there. So these drastic measures sort of make sense. But of course, this bill hasn't been without controversy. Given its limiting of English, restrictive language requirements, and strict enforcement methods, the bill actually allows provincial legislators to override sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is basically like Canada's version of America's Bill of Rights. So those who feel their rights are infringed upon will not be able to use the overridden articles of the Charter to defend themselves. As a result, the bill has been criticized heavily. Executives at more than 150 companies have signed a letter to Legault warning the Premier the law is threatening to do enormous damage to the province's economy, because it creates an unpredictable business environment. This legislation revokes the right to access services in English for some 300,000 to 500,000 English-speaking Quebecers, and will only make the province unappealing for people in sectors where talent is hard to find. Quebec business owners argue anglicisation is inevitable to some extent due to the internet and internationalism of the modern world, and it's inevitable if they are to run their operations efficiently. Meanwhile, Indigenous groups have also demanded an exemption from the bill, citing the need for Indigenous nations to have the freedom to hire whoever they desire, regardless of their first language, in order to fill human resource needs in their respective territories. In the end, the Quebec government wants to protect the French language at any cost. And, I mean, the people of Quebec overwhelmingly voted for this government, so they must want to as well. It's not like it's a foreign concept either. We always want to protect the things we love. Only time will tell though if all these measures work, or if Quebec ends up becoming anglicized like Louisiana did so many years ago. Thank you for watching.